The first thing I smelled was my father's expensive cologne, mixed with the metallic tang of blood pooling on the cold office carpet. My brother Caleb was standing over me, and for the first time in my life, he wasn't smiling. In exactly 3 hours, the police will walk into the Sterling Gala and arrest me for a murder I didn't commit, while my father toasts to the new era of the company. He didn't just frame me for embezzlement. He's had a digital blueprint for my professional execution sitting on his server for years. Now, my only witness is dead in a warehouse, and the woman who held the proof of my innocence has been taken. I can still feel the icy Chicago River water in my lungs. I have no evidence left, and the clock is ticking down to the moment my face hits every news screen in the country as a fugitive. But my father made one mistake. Let me take you back to where this began. The blue light of the monitor etched deep shadows into Julian Sterling's face, casting long, skeletal fingers across the mahogany desk. His fingers danced over the mechanical keyboard, the rhythmic clicks echoing like small bones snapping in the silence of his Chicago home office. On the screen, the succession contingency file sat open, a digital ghost he had never invited in. He leaned forward, the scent of stale espresso and ozone clinging to his wool sweater. He dragged a line of code into the compiler, initiating the counterworm. Lines of green text cascaded down the display, a waterfall of logic designed to bridge the gap between the Sterling Global headquarters downtown and a cluster of ghost accounts in the Caymans. Julian gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white against the dark wood. The cooling fan whirred, a frantic heartbeat inside the tower. A string of authorization codes flickered. A name crystallized within the metadata, repeated across a dozen fraudulent transfers. Arthur Sterling. Julian stopped breathing. He traced the cursor over his father's digital signature, the pixels blurring as his eyes strained. The clock on the wall ticked once, heavy and resonant. Outside, a branch scraped against the window pane like a fingernail seeking entry. He reached for his phone, his palm slick with sweat against the cold glass. The counterworm hissed through another layer of security, pulling back the veil on a decade of systemic theft. It wasn't just a slush fund. It was a frame-up. Arthur had opened these accounts using Julian's social security number, his digital fingerprints, his private keys. The realization hit Julian like a physical blow to the solar plexus. His own father hadn't just built an empire. He had built a cage, and the door was about to slam shut. Julian began typing frantically, his mind racing to map the infection. He needed to isolate the fraudulent injections before the morning audit. 38, 39, 40. He whispered the numbers under his breath, a rhythmic anchor against the rising tide of panic. He adjusted his sleeves, ensuring the white fabric of shirt number 12 met his wrists at the exact same millimeter. Chaos was a single thread, and he refused to let it unravel. The silence of the house was interrupted by a soft, rhythmic thudding from the hallway. Julian froze. He didn't have visitors at 2 a.m. He slid a heavy glass paperweight into his palm, the cold crystal biting into his skin. The door creaked open, and the smell of expensive cologne and rain-dampened wool preceded the intruder. Caleb Sterling leaned against the doorframe, a predatory smile stretching his face. His two white veneers caught the blue light of the monitors. He was picking at his cuticles, a small smear of red staining his thumb. "Working late, big brother?" Caleb asked, his voice dripping with a false, honeyed concern. "Father mentioned you might be feeling the pressure. Embezzlement is a heavy weight to carry." Julian didn't look up from the screen. "The data suggests you are trespassing, Caleb. Please exit the perimeter." "The perimeter?" Caleb laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "You always were a robot." but even robots can be scrapped. Father's moving the board meeting up. He thinks the company needs a leader with a human touch, someone who isn't a ghost in a machine. Julian's fingers never faltered. He was already routing the counterworm through a secondary path, tracing the source of Caleb's confidence. Your presence is a distraction with diminishing returns. Leave. Caleb straightened his tie, his eyes lingering on the screen for a second too long before he turned and vanished into the shadows of the hallway. Julian waited until the front door clicked shut before he let out a jagged breath. He wasn't safe. Not here. Not anywhere. The next morning, the air in the Sterling Global headquarters tasted of industrial cleaner and filtered oxygen. Julian walked through the lobby, his eyes scanning the bruised purple glow of the overhead lights. He felt the weight of the succession contingency file in his mind like a leaden weight. He reached his office, but before he could sit, a woman appeared in the glass doorway. Sarah Johnson looked like she hadn't slept since the turn of the century. Her hair was a bird's nest of brown curls, and her glasses were smudged with thumbprints. She wore a courier's windbreaker that was 2 sizes too large. She didn't say hello. Instead, she stepped inside and closed the door with a soft click. "I have something for you," she whispered, her eyes darting to the floor. She reached into her bag and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound book. "It's the physical ledger for the North Pier shipments. The digital records are a lie, Julian. This is the truth." Julian stared at the book. Logic dictated he should take it. It was the missing piece, the physical evidence of systemic shipment tampering and illegal smuggling that Arthur had used to pad the company's valuation. With this, he could prove the offshore accounts were just the tip of a much larger, much dirtier iceberg. He reached out, his fingers brushing the cold, cracked leather. "Why give this to me, Sarah?" Julian asked, his voice low. "You were fired for looking into this, because I'm tired of the wrong people winning," she said, her voice trembling. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper, a grocery list. Milk, eggs, bread, kale. She smoothed it over with a shaking hand. "Take it. Save yourself." Subverted. Julian took the ledger. It was a heavy, reassuring weight in his hands. He felt a surge of genuine hope, a rare spark of optimism that cut through his usual cold calculations. This made perfect sense. Arthur was a man of the digital age, obsessed with his surveillance and his encrypted servers. But he had a blind spot for the physical world. A handwritten ledger was something he couldn't hack, couldn't delete, and couldn't rewrite with a few keystrokes. Julian saw the path to victory clearly. He would present this to the board, show the discrepancy between the physical manifests and the digital reports, and watch his father's empire crumble under the weight of its own lies. He felt a rare tension release in his shoulders. For the first time in weeks, his breathing slowed. "Thank you, Sarah," Julian said, a small, tight smile forming on his lips. "This changes the variables. I can win this." Sarah nodded, a look of profound relief washing over her tired features. "I knew you were the right one to go to. I'll wait for your signal." She turned and slipped out of the office, leaving Julian alone with the evidence. He sat at his desk, opening the ledger to the first page. The ink was old, the handwriting precise. He felt like he was holding his father's heart in his hands. He began to cross-reference the dates with the fraudulent transfers he had discovered the night before. Everything lined up perfectly. It was a masterpiece of corruption, and he held the key. He heard a heavy, rhythmic thump, 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 thump against the glass wall of his office. Julian froze. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. The Sterling tap. The door swung open, but it wasn't Arthur. It was Christopher Brown, the head of corporate security, followed by 3 men in dark suits. Brown didn't look at Julian. He looked at the ledger. "Mr. Sterling?" Brown said, his voice like grinding stones. "We've received a report of stolen company property, a physical manifest from the restricted archives." Julian felt a cold prickle of unease. "This is evidence of a crime, Christopher. I am securing it for the board." Brown stepped forward, his eyes devoid of emotion. "Actually, Julian, we have security footage of you receiving that book from a terminated employee. An employee who was recently caught attempting to sell company secrets to a competitor. Taking that book makes you an accessory to theft and corporate espionage." Julian looked down at his hands. He realized with a jolt of horror that he had been holding the book without gloves. His fingerprints were smeared across the covers, the spine, the pages. He hadn't just secured evidence. He had walked directly into a trap. The ledger wasn't his salvation. It was the smoking gun that would link him to the very smuggling operations he was trying to expose. Arthur hadn't left a blind spot. He had built a lure. "Give me the book, Julian," Brown said, reaching out a hand. "No," Julian whispered. He lunged for his laptop, trying to trigger the wipe sequence, but the guards were faster. The struggle was brief and brutal. Julian felt a heavy fist slam into his ribs, the air escaping his lungs in a sharp wheeze. He swung the heavy crystal paperweight, catching one guard in the temple with a sickening crack, but the other 2 pinned him against the mahogany desk. The scent of ozone and copper filled the air. They wrenched the ledger from his grip, the leather tearing slightly. "Check his pockets," Brown commanded. Julian felt his world tilting. He had been so sure of his logic, so confident in his superior intellect. But he had forgotten the most basic rule of the game. His father didn't play by the rules of data. He played by the rules of power. As the guards dragged him toward the private elevator, Julian realized he wasn't just losing the company. He was losing his freedom. He managed to twist his arm free for a split second, slamming his elbow into a guard's throat. The man gagged, his grip loosening. Julian didn't think. He ran. He dived into the service elevator just as the doors were closing, the metal screeching as it cut off the guard's pursuit. He leaned against the cold steel wall, his chest heaving, his ribs screaming in pain. He reached into his inner coat pocket. His fingers brushed against something thin and crinkled. He pulled it out. It was a single page Sarah had tucked into the ledger at the last second, the final page containing the private signatures of the warehouse receivers. It wasn't the whole ledger, but it was enough to prove the chain of custody. He hadn't lost everything yet. Julian emerged into the rain-slicked streets of Chicago, the bruised purple light of the street lamps making the puddles look like oil spills. He navigated the back alleys, his mind counting. 41, 42, 43. He needed a safe place. He needed Sarah. He met her at a prearranged spot, a crumbling pier on the edge of the river, where the wind whipped the water into whitecaps. Sarah was waiting under a rusted overhang, her windbreaker soaked through. "They took it," Julian said, his voice raw. "They knew you were coming." Sarah looked at him, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm so sorry, Julian. I thought I could help." She reached out and touched his arm, her hand cold and trembling. "There's something you need to know. I wasn't just a lawyer for the firm. I was your mother's counsel. Before she died, she gave me a file. She knew what Arthur was doing. She spent 10 years trying to protect you from him." Julian felt a strange, hollow sensation in his chest. "My mother, she died in an accident. It wasn't an accident, Sarah whispered. Arthur found out she was talking to the feds. He didn't just build this company, Julian. He sacrificed everything to keep it, including her. The weight of the revelation pressed against Julian's eardrums until the air tasted of copper. He looked at the dark water of the river, the groaning of the wooden pilings sounding like a funeral dirge. He had spent his life trying to prove he was better than his father by following the rules, by being the perfect successor. But the rules were a lie. The system was rigged. "We have 48 hours, Julian said, his voice hardening. Arthur moved the meeting up. He's going to announce the succession contingency and have me arrested in front of the board. We need to find the source of the shipments." "The warehouse," Sarah said, wiping her eyes. "The North Pier warehouse. That's where the physical records are kept. If we can find the original manifests, we can prove the ledger they took from you was a forgery." They drove through the city in a rented sedan, the wipers slapping rhythmically against the windshield. Julian felt the concussion from the office struggle thumping in his temples. The city felt predatory, the skyscrapers like jagged teeth waiting to snap shut. They reached the warehouse at midnight. It was a vast, hollow space that smelled of salt and rotting wood. A single light flickered in the office at the far end of the floor. Julian led the way, his footsteps echoing on the concrete. "Robert?" Julian called out. Robert Chen was the manager, a man who washed his hands 3 times after every doorknob. He was the only one who could verify the manifests. There was no answer. Only the rhythmic drip of water hitting a metal drum. Drip, drip, drip. Julian pushed open the office door. The smell hit him first. The sharp, metallic scent of fresh blood mixed with the chemical tang of bleach. Robert Chen was slumped over his desk. His hands were clean, but his throat had been opened with surgical precision. A single red high-heeled shoe sat perfectly upright in the center of the desk, a grotesque centerpiece in the middle of the crime scene. "Oh, God," Sarah gasped, clutching her grocery list to her chest. Julian didn't move. He heard the distant, rising wail of sirens. He looked at the security monitor on the wall. It wasn't showing the warehouse floor. It was showing a live feed of Julian's own face, framed by a red box. "It's another trap," Julian whispered. "He killed Robert and called the police. He's framing me for the murder. We have to go." Sarah pulled at his arm. They scrambled out the back dock just as the first blue and red lights began to reflect off the warehouse windows. They dived into the car, Julian flooring the accelerator. He didn't make left turns. He followed the logic of the streets, weaving through the industrial district, his heart hammering against his ribs. The chase was a blur of screeching tires and blinding headlights. Julian saw a black SUV in his rearview mirror, Arthur's security team. He pushed the car to 80, 90, the engine screaming. He hit the brakes as he approached a sharp curve, but the pedal went soft under his foot. It hit the floorboard with a sickening thud. "The brakes!" Sarah screamed. Julian grabbed the emergency brake, the cable groaning as he yanked it upward. The car fishtailed, the tires smoking as they lost grip on the wet asphalt. They spun across the highway, the world turning into a kaleidoscope of metal and glass. They slammed into a concrete barrier, the airbag exploding in Julian's face with a deafening boom. Silence followed, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine and the hiss of escaping steam. Julian's head throbbed, a warm trickle of blood running down his cheek. He looked over at Sarah. She was unconscious, her head lolling against the window. He heard a car door slam. A pair of polished boots stepped into his field of vision. Caleb Sterling leaned down, looking through the shattered driver's side window. He was picking at his cuticles, his thumbs raw and bloody. "You really should have taken the severance package, Julian. Now, you're just a variable that needs to be deleted." Caleb reached in and grabbed Julian by the collar, dragging him out of the wreckage. Julian's legs felt like jelly. He swung a weak punch, but Caleb caught his wrist, twisting it until Julian dropped to his knees. "Where's the ledger page?" Caleb hissed. "In the river," Julian lied, his voice a raspy whisper. Caleb slammed his knee into Julian's chest, sending him sprawling onto the pavement. "You're lying. You always count when you lie. 38, 39. I can hear you, Ghost." Caleb raised a lead pipe, the metal glinting in the purple twilight. Julian rolled to the side, the pipe smashing into the asphalt where his head had been a second before. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the fire in his ribs. He lunged at Caleb, using his weight to tackle him into the shadows of a concrete pillar. They fought like animals, a messy, desperate struggle devoid of the precision Julian loved. He felt Caleb's teeth sink into his shoulder, felt the sting of a blade grazing his arm. He found a tactical opening, a loose piece of rebar sticking out of the pillar. He slammed Caleb's hand against it, the metal piercing his brother's palm. Caleb screamed, a high-pitched, jagged sound. Julian didn't wait. He grabbed Sarah from the car and dragged her toward a passing taxi that had stopped to see the wreck. "Drive," Julian shouted, shoving a wad of hundreds into the driver's hand. They ended up in a safe house, a claustrophobic apartment with boarded-up windows and the overpowering smell of bleach. Julian sat on the floor, his back against the wall, watching Sarah as she slowly regained consciousness. "We found the address," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "In the ledger page, the hidden server." Julian pulled out his laptop, his fingers shaking as he typed. He accessed the server address, a ghost site hosted in a maintenance terminal at the hotel where the gala was being held. He began to download the data, the progress bar moving with agonizing slowness. He saw the names, the signatures, the transfers. He stopped breathing. It wasn't just Arthur. Every fraudulent document, every offshore transfer, every forged manifest had been signed by the same person, Michael Davis, his mentor, the man who had taught him how to read a balance sheet, the man who had given him his first set of cufflinks. Julian felt a cold, hollow void opening up inside him. He wasn't just being hunted by his father. He had been betrayed by the only person he ever truly trusted. "Julian?" Sarah asked, seeing the look on his face. "Michael," Julian whispered. "He's the architect. Arthur is just the client." He knew what he had to do. He lured Michael to a secluded pier near the Chicago River, promising him a secret payoff in exchange for his silence. He waited in the shadows, the wind whipping his coat around his legs. Michael Davis arrived, looking like a trustworthy uncle in his soft wool coat. He was humming a low, mournful funeral dirge. "Julian," Michael said, his voice full of practiced sorrow. "I'm so glad you called. We can fix this. We can tell the board it was all Caleb's idea." "I saw the signatures, Michael," Julian said, stepping into the light. "I saw the server logs. You didn't just help Arthur. You built the cage." Michael's smile didn't falter, but his eyes went cold. "The good guys finish last, Julian. I learned that a long time ago. Your father is a monster, but he pays well. And monsters are very good at making people disappear." "I have the evidence," Julian said, holding up the flash drive. "Confess, and I'll make sure you get a plea deal." Michael laughed, a soft, tuneless sound. "You're still thinking like a coder, Julian. You think if you find the bug, The system will fix itself. But the system is the bug. Michael lunged at him with a concealed knife, the blade glinting in the dark. They grappled on the edge of the pier, the wooden pilings groaning beneath them. Michael was stronger than he looked, his movements fueled by a desperate, predatory energy. He slammed Julian against the railing, the cold metal biting into his back. "Everything ends in the grave, Julian," Michael hissed, his breath smelling of peppermint and rot. He shoved Julian backward. Julian felt the world fall away as he plunged into the freezing black water of the Chicago River. The cold was a physical assault, 1,000 needles piercing his skin. He sank into the darkness, the light of the moon disappearing above the surface. He fought the urge to inhale, his lungs burning. He kicked off his shoes, his fingers numbing as he clawed his way back toward the light. He broke the surface, gasping for air that tasted of oil and salt. He watched as Michael's car sped away, leaving him to drown in the icy currents. Subverted, Julian dragged himself onto the muddy bank, his body shaking with uncontrollable tremors. He was suffering from stage 1 hypothermia, his skin a ghostly blue, but he didn't stop. He pushed himself toward the safe house, his mind focused on a single goal: get the drive to Sarah. He had the confession on record. He'd had his phone recording the entire encounter with Michael. This was the final nail. With the digital evidence from the server and Michael's voice admitting to the fraud, he didn't just have a defense. He had a weapon that could decapitate the entire Sterling empire in one blow. He felt a grim sense of triumph. He had survived the water, survived the betrayal, and now he held the truth. He reached the safe house, his frozen fingers fumbling with the keypad. "Sarah," he croaked, pushing the door open. "I have it. I have the recording." He stepped inside, expecting to see her at the laptop, her messy hair illuminated by the screen. Instead, he was met with a wall of silence. The apartment had been ransacked. The laptop was gone. The table where they had shared a meal was overturned, the silverware replaced with jagged shards of a broken mirror. "Sarah," Julian's voice cracked. He saw her grocery list lying on the floor, torn in half. Milk, eggs. The rest was gone. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out with shaking hands. It was a video call from a restricted number. He swiped the screen. Arthur Sterling's face appeared, his silver hair slicked back, his gaze as cold as a server room. Behind him, Sarah was tied to a chair, a piece of heavy gray duct tape covering her mouth. Her eyes were wide with terror. "You always were a slow learner, Julian," Arthur said, his voice calm and metronomic. "You thought you were playing a game of logic, but I'm playing a game of legacy. And a legacy requires the removal of any imperfections." "Let her go, Father," Julian said, his voice trembling. "I'll give you the drive. I'll sign the confession, just don't hurt her." Arthur smiled, a thin, cruel line. "The drive? Oh, Julian, my hackers remotely wiped your cloud storage 10 minutes ago. And as for your physical drive, well, Christopher is standing right behind you." Julian turned, but he was too late. A heavy boot slammed into his chest, sending him flying across the room. Christopher Brown stood in the doorway, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He stepped on Julian's wrist, the bones snapping with a sickening pop. He reached down and took the flash drive from Julian's limp fingers. "The board meeting starts in 3 hours," Arthur said from the phone. "I've already released the evidence of your confession to the press. You're a murderer, a thief, and a failure. And by the time the sun comes up, you won't even be a Sterling." The call ended. Christopher looked down at Julian, his eyes devoid of pity. "Redirecting," he muttered, mimicking his GPS, before turning and walking out, locking the heavy steel door behind him. Julian lay on the floor, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. He had nothing. No evidence, no ally, no empire. He was a ghost in a broken machine, trapped in a wooden coffin while his father prepared to bury him alive. He looked at the torn grocery list on the floor. Milk, eggs. He thought of Sarah. He thought of his mother. He thought of the 47 white shirts in his closet, each one a shield against the chaos. He began to count. 1, 2, 3. He didn't need a computer to hack the system. He was the system. He knew the internal logistics of the hotel better than anyone. He knew the maintenance schedules, the override codes, the hidden service tunnels. He used a shard of the broken mirror to pick the lock on the window. His movements precise, despite the pain in his wrist. He dropped onto the fire escape, the cold wind whipping against his face. He arrived at the Manhattan Hotel an hour later, moving through the service tunnels like a shadow. He bypassed the security teams by hiding in the laundry chute, the vibration of the distant dryers rattling against his spine. The scent of bleach and expensive linen was overwhelming. He reached the maintenance terminal, a forest of gray servers and tangled wires. He saw the framed photo of his mother sitting atop the main server rack. It was a message from Arthur, a reminder of what happens to those who challenge him. Julian didn't look away. He plugged his phone into the terminal, his fingers dancing over the keyboard. He didn't just want to clear his name. He wanted to burn the empire down. He found the file he was looking for. Not the embezzlement records, but Caleb's private cloud. He saw the encrypted communications with Global Logistics Corp. He saw the blueprints for the company's core source code, marked for delivery to a Russian shell company. Caleb wasn't just a pawn, he was a traitor. Julian hijacked the gala's audiovisual system, bypassing Arthur's encryption with a sequence he had written when he was 12. He waited until the ballroom was full, until the champagne was flowing and the board was seated. He watched on the monitor as Arthur took the stage, his silver hair gleaming under the crystal chandelier. "It is a sad day for Sterling Global," Arthur began, his voice echoing through the ballroom. "My son, Julian, has betrayed the values of this institution." Julian hit enter. The massive screens behind Arthur flickered. The image of Julian's confession vanished, replaced by a high-definition video of Caleb meeting with a Russian operative in a dark parking garage. The audio was crystal clear, Caleb's voice, bragging about how easy it was to steal from his father. The ballroom went silent. Julian watched as Caleb's face went pale, his hands shaking as he picked at his cuticles. Julian stepped out of the shadows and into the penthouse suite, where Arthur had retreated as the chaos erupted downstairs. Arthur was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city. The room was bone-chillingly cold. A single loaded revolver sat on the mahogany desk, pointing toward the door. "You ruined it," Arthur said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You destroyed the legacy." "I saved the company from a traitor," Julian said, stepping into the light. "The feds are already on their way, Father. Caleb's treason will trigger a full investigation into every account you've ever opened. Unless..." Arthur turned, his eyes narrowing. "Unless what?" "Unless you sign the chairmanship over to me," Julian said, holding out a tablet. "I'll use my logistical expertise to bury the trail. I'll make sure the investigation stops at Caleb. You get to retire with your reputation intact. And I get the empire." Arthur looked at the gun, then at Julian. He saw the cold, metronomic light in his son's eyes. He saw the rigid posture, the precise movements. The total lack of empathy. He saw himself. Arthur picked up the pen and signed the screen. "You're more like me than I thought, Julian. I hope you enjoy the loneliness." Julian didn't answer. He walked back to the ballroom, standing on the stage as the board members gave him a standing ovation. He watched as the police led Caleb and Michael away in handcuffs. He had won. He found Sarah in a holding room in the basement, her eyes red from crying. She looked at him with a mixture of relief and terror. "Julian," she whispered. He didn't hug her. He didn't ask if she was okay. He simply straightened his cufflinks, ensuring the fabric met his wrists at the exact same point. "The situation has been stabilized, Sarah," he said, his voice metronomic and flat. "The variables have been aligned." He caught his reflection in the mirror behind her. His jaw was sharp, his eyes scanning for vulnerabilities. He looked at his hands. They were steady, cold, and clean. He looked exactly like Arthur. 38, 39, 40. He whispered the numbers under his breath, a rhythmic anchor against the silence. The empire was his. The machine was running perfectly, and the ghost was finally in control.